I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the program, I want to remind you that I am currently without any advertisers or sponsors. So, it is you, the listener, that will help keep this show going and growing for the foreseeable future. And you can do that by donating to patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. With that out of the way, we have returning guest Mickey Huff of Project Censored, along with his colleague and first-time guest Shealeigh Voitl, to discuss the latest edition of Project Censored's annual book, examining the most important stories that haven't received enough attention from the establishment press in the past year. I'm talking about Project Censored's State of the Free Press 2025. If you're a longtime listener, you'll know about the work of Project Censored. If not, well, you're in for a treat. We're going to be discussing a number of issues, including junk food news, a concept that is highly relevant to our current moment, along with a number of other issues. So, with that being said, let's get right to it with Mickey and Shealeigh. Welcome back to Parallax Views. Returning guest, longtime friend of the show, Mickey Huff, and first-time guest, Shealeigh Voitl. They're going to be speaking with us about the latest edition of Project Censored's State of the Free Press. It's Project Censored's State of the Free Press 2025, and we're going to be looking at, and Mickey is holding up the book for me. So we're going to be looking at the state of media today, and I guess where I want to start with is if there's any differences maybe between this year's State of the Free Press 2025 and previous years. And maybe for my listeners, Mickey, just give a rundown to newer listeners about what the yearly Project Censored book is about.
Sure, JG, happy to do that. And it's great to be back on Parallax Views. Always appreciate coming on with you. And you always have on great folks. So we're honored to be among the many people that you have on the program. Project Censored was founded in 1976 at Sonoma State University in Northern California. It's come a long way since then. Our 50th anniversary is coming up next year. We are the longest contiguously existing media watchdog in the country. We're 10 years older than Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Your folks out there should know about Extra and Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. One of the things that kind of sets us apart from other media watchdogs is that we are connected to critical media literacy education and news literacy education. So we don't just we're not like a 24/7 breaking newsroom kind of thing. We are more analytical about what's in the news and what's not, what makes the news and doesn't. It's Project Censored. The when we talk about the censored books year after year, whether it was Carl Jensen or Peter Phillips, the tagline was the news that didn't make the news and why, right? So we look at the structural kinds of censorship that exist in places like the United States that have free press structures, but have a lot of censorship by proxy, not just government, but actually censorship by corporations, corporate media, big tech, and these kind of things. Well, they really do curate information. So what we do is we have students across the country on usually a dozen or 2 dozen campuses researching independent alternative media to find important fact-based stories that are left out of the corporate media, out of legacy or establishment press, the so-called mainstream, but there's nothing mainstream about 6 corporations and 5 tech companies that control much of our media ecosystem. So this is our small effort to put together a book every year that we have a list of nearly 30 judges that go through and rank, rate, vet, and fact check these kinds of independent media stories. So we want to highlight what the independent media do well. Occasionally, the corporate media, of course, do cover stories that are very important. And so this is not we don't just bash, with a big bludgeon, and we don't just paint broadly that all corporate media is bad. We think that people need to think critically about all forms of media. And one of the things that the independent press do is they get us to think about issues from different perspectives and different lenses. And yes, they have biases just like the corporate media, but they tend to wear them on their sleeves rather than pretend they don't exist. So they allow people to build relationships with them. And that's a big part of media literacy, is being more and more aware of that ecosystem and what shapes the information. We're very interested in helping people how they can improve how they think critically. We are not interested in telling people what to think. And we don't tell people this is the source for truth and this is the source for lies. We try to teach people a series of processes. We teach about the propaganda model. Shealeigh did a brilliant frame checking guide with our associate director, Andy Lee Roth. It's for free on our website at projectcensored.org. By the way, all of our top underreported stories dating back to 1976 are on our website for free, along with a lot of our other teaching material. So in a nutshell, we're we try to do as much as we can in the classroom. We try to relate it out of the classroom. We do an annual book. We have a weekly radio show in its 15th year on Pacifica Radio, the Project Censored show that I host with Eleanor Goldfield. We have these free education guides. And a few years ago, we started the Censored Press. We now publish our own materials and other books about very important underreported topics from the corporate media and also media literacy. So that's if we're in the Burj Khalifa, that was my elevator pitch.
And I'll let you both answer this question. But I sort of asked there if there's anything you think is different about this year's State of the Free Press. What I mean by that is, Mickey and I, when we've talked about this on the show before and gone over the previous annual editions of State of the Free Press, we've sort of talked about a lot of topics of import, such as, the issues with digital media and like digital media oligarchy, the Elon Musks of the world, things like disinformation. These have been recurring themes. Are there any like newer themes you're seeing emerge when it comes to the problems that our media ecosystem faces? Do you want to take that first, Mickey, and then
I'll let Shealeigh start off.
Yeah, yeah, each year, we see, certain themes represented throughout the list. I think most often we see environmental issues underreported by the corporate media. I think we're seeing that sort of play out right now during the wildfires in terms of the quality of reporting by the establishment press. But yeah, for instance, this year, our number 3 story was based on a pair of articles from The Guardian and The Conversation, and it covered saltwater intrusion from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi River, infiltrating freshwater systems of the Delta region and contaminating drinking and agricultural water supplies. But yeah, this year we saw a lot of, issues concerning big tech and social media, like the 5th story on this year's list, which concerned abortion services being censored globally on social platforms, including, Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. And our 10th story discussed generative AI security concerns, exposing sensitive data and exposing organizations to cyber attacks. And there were also, obviously, too, there were stories of, hope and solution, which I think is the thing that I most like to highlight when we talk about the top 25. Our 23 story was about in-hospital schools developing new ways of addressing urgent mental health crises among young people. But Robert Hackett, one of Project Censored's judges, kind of mentioned before that for corporate media, news is about what happened today, not necessarily what happens every day. And so these stories represented in our top 25 list are about those things that happen every day that affect the daily lives of everyday people, because they're rooted in systemic inequalities. So I think these themes that we see every year remain consistent because those inequalities are inescapable in our society.
Yeah, actually, and to build, that was a great response, Shealeigh. And I think that the Hackett thesis that you just put forward is such a big one because our corporate commercial media is really, just attracted to, the spectacle, right? And even when it's covering a real significant story, it gets so caught up in the now of the spectacle that it doesn't take a step back to connect dots, provide context, go back 20, 50 years, whatever it is, right? To show that these are systemic concerns in many cases. And so it's interesting because, JG, I like your question is like, what's new, right? And I think that there's a lot of patterns that aren't new. We still do our junk food news chapter every year, right? This year we looked at, we were looking at Barbie and pink washing. We do the news abuse, which this year focused a lot on Gaza. We still do Media Democracy in Action that looks at organizations that are doing really great things around First Amendment free expression issues. Because again, to play on what Shealeigh just so importantly pointed out, we don't just point out what's going wrong. We point out what's going on that works for people. We point examples of organizations that really do have free press principles. They do operate under a code of ethics from the Society of Professional Journalists. They are interested in reporting things or even in solutions-oriented ways in the public interest. And when we're constantly sort of under this deluge of the noise of what's happening with X and what's Elon Musk doing now and what government body is being taken down and what crazy thing. Like we wrote about this in the United States of Distraction. The corporate media got so sucked up into the whirlwind of Trump's noise machine that they stopped being able to hold anybody accountable for anything. Well, we're back. It's almost like we didn't leave it. But we're back in the whole first blitzkrieg shock and awe, which is the language they're using of the early days of the second Trump administration. It's just so chaos, so division, do everything so outlandishly and absurdly and illegally that everybody kind of collectively freaks out and shuts down. It's like it's an overload to the nervous system. The regulation to that is journalists are supposed to say time out. They're supposed to stop the fire hose of prevarication. They're supposed to stop the nonsense of the distraction. And they're supposed to say, wait a minute. Are we allowed to do this? Do you have the authority to do this? Under what sources is what you're saying accurate or true? And unfortunately, we see those kinds of things coming from the independent press and from independent outlets. But the corporate media, again, as Shealeigh was talking about with the everyday, right? The corporate media just gets sucked into this constant cycle, and it can't get itself out of it. It's the rinse repeat thing, and then they just move to the next crazy thing. Like just in the last 72 hours, JD Vance was on the Sunday morning shows once again, like lying every other statement, and they can't even keep up the fact check it. That goes on unabated. Meanwhile, Musk and Trump say that we're sending $100 million of condoms to Hamas. That's just complete nonsense. Talk about the return of fake news. They were talking about, part of Mozambique and they're geographically illiterate, and yet they say these completely false things. And the media is like, yeah, what's going on with Hamas and sending condoms, instead of just stopping it and pointing out how completely bogus and nonsensical it is. So we're back to that cycle, right? So you were talking about what's new. Well, unfortunately, none of that is new. I think something that's coming along, JG, that's new. The other thing, by the way, that Trump was crowing about was the tariff concessions that Canada and Mexico are taking my stuff seriously, and I'm going to give them 30 days to give me what I want. It's nonsense. He called for 10,000 troops on the Mexican border. There's already 15,000 there. He's asking for something that's already happened so he can come back and make a statement to make it look like he's done something from a problem he created that doesn't exist. If the media could pay attention long enough to figure that out and call it out every time, right? That's something new I would like to see. One of the newer things, JG, though, is the speed and breadth and repetition that I think is picking up from where Trump left off last time. And it's just a barrage. And it's an onslaught of nonsense, unconstitutional behavior, absolutely egregious statements, completely sexist, misogynistic, and racist statements coming from even people like the Undersecretary of State. I'd like to say that even though that's not new in our history, the fact that it's being done in broad daylight with no real, not even any euphemisms, at best, they're dog whistling through bullhorns. This is what needs to be called out. What we need to see that's new is an elevation of independent media that holds these officials to account, that does not allow them to steamroll. And look, there's lots of ways we can do that. But the first way, I think, is by addressing the paucity of local independent journalism that exists, the lack of media literacy that we have in this country. And we have to start thinking about the solutions, not as the immediate band-aid to cover up what latest idiotic thing just happened, but what are we going to do to gird ourselves against this kind of mendacity and corruption over the next decade, right? That's what needs to be happening. So if there's anything new here that we're addressing in the censored books, I think it's just that we're seeing more of the same kind of stories being underreported, right? So it's not new. It's just more. But there's another thing we're seeing too. We're seeing more groups scale to address it. We're seeing more people understand that there's a problem, even if they can't exactly put their finger on it. But we are in a moment right now. We don't, if we only had an opposition party, JG, we are in a moment right now where we are ripe to have a real opposition. And where the political institutions and political parties fail, that's where the fourth estate is supposed to step in as a true check and balance. And if the corporate media is a lapdog adjunct to that corrupt system, this is the time for independent media to shine. This is the time for a movement media alliance. And this is what we're trying to build this year.
I guess the next question then is, you know, if there isn't, maybe I shouldn't have worded my question as what's new. Maybe I should have worded it as what are the most critical weak points of our current media ecosystem? Is it the junk food news? Is it the news deserts? Is it the oligarchic control of media? I just had a friend of Project Censored, Victor
Victor
Picard, on
Picard.
that.
Victor is
So
brilliant. Yep.
where for you, both of you? I mean, where do you think the biggest weak points are in our media ecosystem right now? Shealeigh, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. Mickey and Andy highlighted in their introduction, the Reporters Without Borders yearly index on press freedom, which ranked the US 55th among 180 nations. And this was a 5-point decline from 2023. And so I think there are a lot of factors that contributed to this decline. Obviously, one being the United States highly concentrated media ownership, which prioritizes profit over, public interest journalism. And yeah, you mentioned, the rise in news deserts. Local news is dying. And so there's this reliance on broadcast media that is not always painting a full picture, not always providing full context. And public trust in media is like at an all-time low. And additionally, obviously, there's hostility from political figures such as Donald Trump, toward the media. And so there's also this pervasive disinformation from his party and other associated political figures. And it's, a super broad and growing issue. And I think in this book in particular, the news abuse chapter was extremely disturbing. It was written by Robin Anderson, and it was entirely about Gaza. The corporate media coverage of Israel's assault on Gaza, largely failed to provide the full context and depth needed for an informed public discourse, including, Palestinian perspectives and voices, international law violations. And then also, there's an issue with bias and terminology. For example, in the Times reporting between October 7th and November 14th, the newspaper used the word massacre 53 times when it referred to Israelis being killed by Palestinians, but only once to refer to Palestinians being killed by Israel. So these are, pervasive patterns in reporting, but, we see this decline, and it really is jarring to see the public trust the media less and less, but given the patterns of reporting, it's not a mystery why. And so that's why, in this year's book and in every single State of the Free Press volume, we champion independent media because that's where we see the changes that we want to see in the establishment press.
Yeah, and adding to that, JG, I'm now also the distinguished director of the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College that gives out the Izzy Award every spring, named after the legendary muckraker I.F. Stone. And Jeff Cohen helped found the program here from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting 17 years ago, back at about 17 years ago. And the alignment between Project Censored and the Park Center is extraordinary, because both of us really see the promise of independent public interest journalism as providing the kinds of solutions that we need as we become more of a commercially addled authoritarian society. We become, in some bizarre fashion, we become more illiterate the more we consume of media. Right? It's a very bizarre thing. And so I think the purposeful calling attention to it, which is something Project Censored has always done, and the purposeful calling attention to journalism that is in the public interest, what it looks like versus the noise of what we see, on CNN or MSNBC or Fox or the networks, right? It's a way that gives people an opportunity who already know that, look, as Shealeigh said, public trust in the legacy media is at an all-time low. Well, that's not for no reason. It's a deserved response to just being hit with he said, she said, false balancing, both sidesing. And look, one of the most glaring things that's been happening around the world the past year plus is, this massive genocide that's taking place in Gaza, where you've got more than half a dozen international organizations blowing the whistle on it. And at the New York Times, they're trying to figure out what words their reporters aren't allowed to use. Manar Adlai from Mint Press News wrote the foreword to the book this year, and that wasn't an accident. She's a Palestinian-American journalist. Alan McLeod has one of the stories in the top 10 this year who writes for them that talks about how the military uses video game and entertainment companies to recruit people, right? And how the IDF uses them to recruit people and how it dehumanizes people. And it's part of this propaganda campaign. Shealeigh mentioned Robin Anderson from Fordham, who's been with us for years. She wrote a whole chapter about this. Manar calls it out in the foreword to the book. She's like, how, and we now know this too, JG, related. The latest studies come out show that based on the Biden 2020 election and the Harris 2024 election, the number of people that voted for Biden that didn't vote for Harris do fall within that margin of people that were withholding their votes to Democrats because of Gaza. So it is not hyperbolic to suggest that that did play a role in the Democrats losing the election. Yet, what we've seen in the last weeks is a doubling down on all of this. In the last several weeks they were in power, when they had the possibilities to change things, they doubled down. They yanked Sam Husseini, the independent reporter, out of a State Department hagiographic sort of redux where Blinken is just going over how great he's been when he hasn't answered any of these kind of questions. This is all happening at the same time when Ali Abu Nima from Electronic Intifada was just arrested and detained in Switzerland and deported because he was invited to give a talk about media in Palestine. And in Switzerland, now the big ally of the US, NATO, they're actually going to preemptively arrest people because they're not allowed to talk about stuff after they stamped his passport. After he was allowed in the country, they subsequently arrested him and deported him over this issue. I don't know how many red flags you need to see around a certain topic before it starts to smell bad, before people need to really open up their eyes and see there really is something happening. We just discovered the other day that there is at least another 14-some thousand people that have died under the rubble that raises the dead to 61,000 in Gaza. Yet the legacy press here won't report it. They won't report it. And what we do at the project is we highlight the people who do report it, regardless of the consequences, not because they're anti-Semitic, not because they don't like Jewish people. It's because they don't like right-wing authoritarianism, and they don't like ethnic cleansing, and they don't want to see the United States further sully itself in our own history of genocide against the Native Americans, in our own apartheid past of Jim Crow. So here we are again riffing on some things that aren't new, right? But this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like this time. People that are worried about authoritarianism shouldn't be looking for jackboots and brown shirts. They should be looking for social media platforms, X portfolios, Doge. They should be looking for people that aren't masking the fact that they're doing Roman salutes on an inaugural stage. You know, this isn't just a joke. These policies and the ways in which these people are behaving is very authoritarian. You know, you don't have to take Timothy Snyder's word for it as a scholar of authoritarianism and fascism. People are waking up to these problems, but because they get framed as team red, team blue, they get normalized, right? And then people in the independent press that want to call attention to that very normalization process are further attacked. And what you're going to see, JG, is the Democrats gave Trump a big gift on their way out. They gave him H9495, HR 9495, that allows the Treasury Department Secretary to unilaterally, by decree, strip a nonprofit of its status based on anything that it believes is somehow a support of terrorists. So far, they've already been targeting Jewish Voices for Peace. Trump is already looking to target and deport students that protested what was happening in Gaza last year. This is authoritarianism, and the Democrats are also pushing it forward and allowing it to happen. This is why we need a vibrant and independent press to call things as they are. This is why we have a lot of work to do to create civic and media literacy to bolster our civic engagement. And this is why this is no time to play team red, team blue games. This is no time to pretend like anything that's happening in the United States is normal. This is basically a 5-alarm fire, and we need all hands on deck. And if we don't have our independent journalists leading the way, we're not going to know where we're going.
One thing I wanted to delve into was, and I know you don't necessarily want to get into like each one of the stories. That's something when we do these episodes, Mickey, we don't, we want you people to read the book, look at the top 25. We don't have to get into like each and every story, but one thing I am interested in talking about is, these attacks on women's reproductive rights and the media's coverage of that. Because, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, I think it's an important topic.
Yeah. So yeah, that was our fifth story. I think I kind of briefly mentioned it earlier. But it was a report. I'm trying to think actually let me look in the book. Actually, who was the original? It was Women's Media Center, based on a report by Women's Media Center. Yeah, and it talked about the Supreme Court's 2022 Dobbs v. Jackson decision overturning Roe v. Wade, and online abortion content, facing global censorship. It restricted posts about medical abortion, including hiding hashtags for abortion drugs and removing reproductive health information. These platforms were sort of over moderating to avoid these legal risks and stifling access to, vital resources. And I think this is something that's really special about the state of the free press is how many connections you can make in between the chapters. We talk in the junk food news chapter about a lot about Barbie. We talked a lot about Barbie.
I wanted to ask about that and
Yeah,
the pink
no,
washing
yeah.
that Mickey mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the junk food news, if, for listeners that don't know, it sort of refers to these, sensational and consequential stories that the establishment press was covering, sort of diverting attention away from informative news stories, news stories that affect our daily lives. And, they, in this year's chapter, the authors talked about, how much time the establishment press devoted to the news of the Barbie movie. Its branding strategies, its cast, the Oscar snub. I think even, Hillary Clinton likened the Oscar snub to her winning the popular vote in 2016, the presidential election, but losing the Electoral College, which is just so ridiculous. But, devoting extensive attention to, a pop culture phenomenon like Barbie, the corporate media creates this sort of illusion that it champions women and women's issues. And then you see stories, featured in the top 25 that obviously completely contradict that in a million different ways. And, these stories, about Barbie and all of these other superficial things, focus on, rather than addressing systemic challenges faced by women, such as, wage inequality, reproductive rights, or violence against women, they are surface level, hurrah, love being women, supporting women, but not really diving into, we saw in Gaza, women, going without, sanitary products and facing major issues, reproductive health in Gaza. These are, it's not just in the United States, it's globally. And we just are seeing this lack of attention. For example, a United Nations investigation conducted in February, this was mentioned in the junk food news chapter, uncovered hundreds of reports of Palestinian women and girls arbitrarily detained by the IDF since October 2023. The UN found instances of inhumane treatment, denial of basic necessities, and allegations of sexual assault. So, the junk food news is, I thought, special in that way this year, because it does connect those issues that we see in the top 25, these things that are underreported. And then, what we did see instead, unfortunately. I think the thing, though, that I love about the junk food news chapter, however, is it doesn't shame pop culture readers, or talk down to those readers, the people that enjoy, that stuff. I like that stuff. It's it does an exceptionally great job at highlighting how the public's engagement with celebrity gossip stories might reflect sort of deeper societal issues. This fixation on fame, the media's role in shaping cultural values, the systemic inequalities that undermine, progress. But it encourages those readers to sort of examine the ways in which corporate media has failed them by overrepresenting this news and just completely neglecting stories like the, abortion services being censored story, that drastically impact, average daily lives.
Yeah, yeah, just very quickly, not much to add to Shealeigh's brilliant sort of overview of an analysis of the junk food news issue and chapter. But look, life in plastic, it's fantastic. I mean, Barbie was a whatever 90-minute, 2-hour commercial for Mattel Inc. Which by the way is all kinds of plastic, microplastics, poisoning the environment, landing up in our brains. I mean, again, how something like that, is lauded as some form of, you know, uh, some peak form of feminism in our culture. It's been so utterly co-opted by these corporations that it's not that there's nothing positive that comes out of that kind of movie. And certainly the director of that film had high aspirations for calling attention to important things, excuse me, around women's issues. And you know what? It's just not for everybody, right? It's not a P.T. Barnum effect. There's lots of people in our culture that maybe have a very sophisticated and different understanding of feminism, but there's also another group of people, or a younger group of women, perhaps, that these are things that they're now just thinking about. It's not like our news media really focuses on actual feminist role models. It's not like pop culture even does that. So this is an example where it's being set up in a way that's to see something positive, but then enough with the patriarchy. Ken takes over the movie, and then it goes sideways, and that's the song that people remember. So, I mean, even within the efforts of which they're trying to do something positive, it can't escape the patriarchal bubble of the industry that it's in, right? And we didn't do that to be cynical. And I want to point out something that I think one of the most important things that Shealeigh said, at least for me, was that this is not about finger wagging. It's not about shaming people wherever they are. If somebody learned something important from that kind of a movie and it got them thinking about feminism in a way they never have, then that's amazing. But if we want to walk away and pretend like it's some definitive feminist statement for our times, then I think it shows just how much further we have to go, right? And I think that that's the real point of the patriarchy, and that's why we went through some very painful stories about the abortions, people dying because they can't get access to medical care in the United States, right? I mean, that's absolutely, that's preposterous that these kind of things can be happening. But the way in which corporate media cover it is they false balance it. They both sides it. They're like, well, the law in Texas says, burr, burr, burr. Well, we might. No, man, this is life and death stuff. These are basic human rights. Women are human beings with equal rights as other people. A majority of the people dying in Palestine are women and children. So I don't need to hear Hillary Clinton standing up about the snub here and there. What did you do for Palestine? What have you done for women's issues? When the Democrats could have codified any kind of protection for Roe, what did they do? Nothing. This is the thing we have to remember, that these people cannot be trusted, and they need to be pushed and pushed and pushed by the independent media and by the electorate to do the right thing, Spike Lee, to do the thing that they say they're going to do, and not to just pretend like, oh, because something was codified into the courts in the 70s, we're all good forever. Well, look where we are now. What century is it? I mean, I keep waiting to see how far back in time we go, right? Are we going back before Jim Crow? Are we going back to, is it Bleeding Kansas? Are we there? When will the wigs run? This isn't funny stuff, especially for historians. And I think that the corporate media in particular does an absolutely lousy job by design to historically contextualize these issues and to report factually in the public interest what we know is going on. We know certain practices are better for women's health. We know certain types of things for education benefit all people better. We know there's systemic racism in certain places that can be called out, that don't involve bogus corporate top-down DEI nonsense. It involves actually addressing inequality where it exists on the grassroots, on the streets, in the local areas, in the communities where it lives. And we need local media and independent journalism to help call that out and to help spearhead those efforts to change those things in meaningful ways, like people before us did before. Many of the things we're facing now might have the appearances of new things, but they're old challenges. And partly we're sinking back into them because we're not doing a good enough job teaching people why we did those things in the first place, why affirmative action was important at the time in the first place, why civil rights legislation was important in the first place, why voting rights to protect were important in the first place. And we've kind of just gone beyond into a United States of amnesia, as Gore Vidal would suggest, where it's almost as if we're like amoebas bumping off of each other, right? Or as Ani DeFranco would sing about the little plastic castle as a surprise to the goldfish every lap of the bowl. That's not a sustainable culture. And as Neil Postman warned years ago, that we were quickly amusing ourselves to death. And if we don't really start to take seriously the kind of things that are happening around us, I'm afraid to suggest, believe it or not, that they actually could get worse.
Before we close out, what are you guys hopeful for when it comes to independent media? And maybe we can leave my listeners on a more positive note in these dark times. I'll let both of you answer that though separately.
Sure.
Yeah. I do. I mean, okay, so I think what I will say is when Trump was first elected, I was 18 and I was like, I felt so powerless. Like I felt like, what am I gonna do about this? You know, I felt scared, I felt small, I felt like there was nothing that I could say or do to change things. Now in his second term, I'm 26. I feel like my work with the project is empowering and it makes me excited to see young people engage with media literacy, and excited about political engagement outside of the electoral voting system, being engaged in ways of protest, in mutual aid, in supporting their communities. And I feel like I hope that State of the Free Press and other politically engaged figures in our media. I know young people really pay attention to social media, and I think there are a lot of young people that are learning and seeing what the corporate media is doing and being, feeling like maybe there's something more that they can do. I feel hopeful that people are paying attention, I guess is what I'm saying. I feel hopeful that people are no longer passively consuming news, that people are seeing these like lame headlines that are misleading and that do such an injustice to the communities they're reporting on. So I feel hopeful in this very dark time that people are energized in a way that maybe we didn't see in the first term, that there were people that just kind of sunk really low and they were like, what are we going to do about this? In the same way that I sort of felt as a teenager. I feel like that's different now. I feel like hopefully this has taught us that we need to lean on each other in a very big way, protect each other in a big way. These marginalized communities that we see represented all over the book constantly that are, facing serious systemic inequalities. Yeah, I feel hopeful that people are learning still and questioning sources and, and breaking the habit of relying on establishment media for all of their information.
Yeah, and JG, I mean, I'm ever hopeful. I've been a professor for 25 years. I have to run on that. I'm hopeful because of people like Shealeigh. Um, I'm hopeful because of my students. We have an amazing crew of young people that joined us in the last couple of years. Reagan Haney, Kate Horgan, Shealeigh has quickly risen, through our ranks, doing absolutely amazing work, reaching out to other people, reaching out to different demographics. That people like me, increasingly, I'm in the gray hair crowd, right? And that's important to cross generations. It's important to talk to people that are in their 70s and 80s for the wisdom that they have to share. But sometimes those people maybe lack the energy, or they might be more jaded. And when we see younger people, they have lots of energy, but they might not have all the wisdom, but they have ideas, right? And I'm very hopeful that we can bring all kinds of people together. When we talk about diversity, it's not just about race and it's not just about gender. It's about age, it's about class, it's about ideology, it's about all kinds of things. And I think independent media is a great sort of nexus. It's a great crux. It's like a fulcrum for this, right? It's where we can get together and we can make sure that these significant stories from these different places get to all the places that they need to go so that we are self-empowered, right? We don't often know how much power we have because the corporate media tries to silo us, to atomize us, and Team Red and Team Blue want to divide us and make things, every issue is a division, right? And look, I think young people are catching on to that. They don't want to live in that world. That's a very stressful world. And they don't even understand what some of these older conflicts are about. They just see them playing out all the time. And I think that what the independent media do is they really help amplify perspectives and voices that remind us that we're in these struggles together, that remind us that they're not new and that we are louder and more successful together in our efforts. And I think that that gets lost. The corporate media, that's not a sexy story, right? That's a slow burn, right? Guess what? Most revolutionary type movements, most movements for massive change don't happen like this. They might get triggered or have a tipping point, but last I checked, we fought against race-based slavery for decades, if not centuries. Women fought for the right to right to vote and the right to be seen as relatively equal people in our society. I know we're not there yet, but I'm saying these struggles continue. When we put a pin in it and say it's over or we fix something, we're doing a disservice to the next generation that pretends something doesn't need to be vigilantly monitored. But we do. This is why we need the independent press. This is why we need local reports. This is why we need media literacy and civic engagement in young people and students. They're the ones that need to carry that mantle, and they need the opportunities to do it. And so me speaking now as someone that's older, in my 50s, I'm trying to do everything I can to make possible different opportunities, different avenues, and different platforms for this new generation of people and people under 40 to go and make it. Gen X is, we're riding out some of the storm here. We didn't create these problems, but we're also not going to fix them on our own, period. We need everybody across the spectrum that's being affected by what's happening to pitch in and join in. And I think those narratives are the ones that you hear in the independent media. And the book this year again has the same, that has the great junk food news and news abuse. We have a brilliant chapter on disinformation and how it's not new, and it deconstructs propaganda from media scholar Bill Usman. That's very relevant and very useful. I'm teaching a fake news class this semester. That's among the readings. I think we need to be hitting home on media literacy, the importance of independent media, and I think we need to push back against the nonstop propaganda, the nonstop kind of mis and disinformation that we see in our legacy media systems and on social media. We need to not turn on each other, and we need to remember, right, what we can do and achieve collectively, right? The corporate media is not telling those stories. It's not profitable for them to talk about those things. We're going to have to do it on our own, in our own ecosystems, in our own platforms, in our own ways. And I'm not only hopeful, I think that I have ample evidence from Shealeigh to all the other people we work with that are people that were demoralized 8, 10 years ago, but have very, very quickly and seriously changed the direction and turned that knob. It's possible. And I dare say that it's not only possible, it's inevitable if we're going to try to make the world a better place for the people that, not only for the people that are here and suffering, but for the people that are not here yet. I think we have an obligation to make that happen. And we're not going to do it by relying on the political culture on its own or in the legacy press. So Project Censored likes to practice what it teaches. And we want you all to go to projectcensored.org. You can check out so many of our materials for free, including Shealeigh's great frame checking guide with Andy Lee Roth. You've heard of fact checking? There's frame checking, right? Reagan Haney's doing brilliant infographics that bring media literacy to people on digital media platforms that we simultaneously criticize. There are ways to push back. There are ways to have these stories told. We just need to keep it going, JG. And because of people like you and the programs that you have, I think we're connecting and we're further expanding that kind of system of communication and community education.
Well, hey, I want to thank both of you for coming on Parallax Views, and I hope everyone will check out Project Censored's State of the Free Press 2025. You know, every year I have to have at least one episode devoted to Project Censored because it's been a big influence on me, and I think the work you guys are doing is extremely important, and I hope people will keep up with Project Censored.
Thanks so much, JG. Thanks for having us.
Yep, it's always a pleasure to be on with you and your audience, and keep doing what you're doing, man. Great shows week after week. We're greatly honored to be here with you.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you support the work here I do at Parallax Views, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.